The day the walls exploded, it was chaos. Sirens screamed. Smoke rolled through the prison halls like a storm. Men were running with fire in their eyes, some with shanks made from toothbrushes, others with pipes ripped from sinks. Guards hid behind doors as fire alarms shrieked and the lights flickered red. The riot had begun. From the rooftop, an inmate called Reaper, his chest covered in ink, his voice echoing, shouted, "This is our freedom day." Shots fired. A guard tower window shattered. Someone threw a burning mattress in the second tier, and flames spread fast. The yard looked like a war zone. Black smoke, screaming voices, and blood on the concrete. This was not just another prison fight. This was the most violent prison riot in history. But how did it all start? To understand, we have to go back to the days before hell broke loose. The pressure builds. Months before the riot, the prison was already boiling. Too many men, too little food, too many gangs. The Black Vultures, Iron Fangs, and Sons of Blood ruled different blocks. Each wanted control. Each hated the others. Then came the lockdowns. Weeks of sitting in dark cells. Cold food through the slot. No visits. No yard time. That's when the rumors started. Whispers that the guards were picking sides. The Vultures swore the Warden was punishing their people harder. The Iron Fangs thought they were being starved on purpose. And deep down, everyone was angry. One day, Reaper, leader of the Vultures, had enough. During chow, a guard slammed his tray on the floor and called him a dog. Reaper didn't move. He just stared, breathing heavy. He said quietly, "Every man's got his breaking point. You just hit mine." That night, he sent a message through the pipes. Tomorrow it begins. By sunrise, every block knew. The guards didn't. And that silence, that calm, was the last quiet this prison would ever know. The first strike, it started during breakfast. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Then, one inmate stood up, flipped his tray, and yelled, "This is for Block C." Within seconds, fists flew. Steel trays slammed against heads. Chairs broke. Blood hit the floor. The guard shouted orders, but there were too many inmates too fast. The alarm blared. Every door locked. But something went wrong. The system jammed. The electronic doors to cell block D didn't close. They opened instead. Hundreds of men rushed out, armed with whatever they could find. The riot spread like wildfire. A young guard, Officer McBride, tried to reach the radio. He never made it. He was hit in the back with a pipe and dragged away. By the time the warden heard the news, it was too late. The prison was no longer under control. The inmates owned it. And Reaper? He climbed to the second-tier rail and shouted, "No one leaves till they bleed." The riot had begun for real. The storm inside. Smoke filled the air. Fire alarms howled. Some inmates fought. Others hid. The gangs had turned the blocks into territories. The Vultures controlled the kitchen. The Iron Fangs took the yard. The Sons of Blood seized the control center. It was every man for himself. A prisoner named Luis, who wasn't part of any gang, tried to crawl under a table. He whispered, "I just want to live." But someone grabbed him, dragged him out. Wrong place, wrong time. The violence didn't stop. On the security cameras, officers watching from the outside saw nothing but smoke and shadows. One of them muttered, "It's like watching the world end." The fire spread to the laundry wing. Plastic melted. Tear gas filled the halls, but it didn't work. The men had covered their faces with wet shirts. Hours passed. The walls were burning. The inmates had taken over the loudspeakers. And through the static came a voice, Reaper's voice, saying, "No more cages. No more guards. Today we take it all." Outside, police surrounded the prison. Inside, it was a nightmare. The final assault. Before dawn, the prison sounded like a battlefield. SWAT teams moved in. Armored trucks broke through the gates. Helicopters hovered above. Inside, the inmates prepared for their last stand. Reaper stood on a table, face covered in soot, shouting, "They can take our lives, but not our freedom." Then came the explosions. Flashbangs lit up the halls. Gunfire echoed off concrete. Men screamed, running in every direction. Tear gas filled the air. Flames turned the cafeteria orange and black. The chaos was total. When the smoke finally cleared, bodies lay scattered across the floor. Inmates, guards, everyone. The riot lasted 47 hours. It left dozens dead and the prison in ruins. Reporters later called it the most violent prison riot in history. But even after the walls were rebuilt, the question remained, why did it really happen? Was it rage, injustice, or revenge? Aftermath of the Bloodstorm. When the riot ended, silence filled the prison. Not peace, silence. The kind of silence that comes after something terrible. Smoke still floated through the halls. The walls were black, the floors wet with blood and water. Dozens of bodies were being carried out, inmates and guards alike. The news cameras showed it all. The broken towers, the shattered windows, the torn prison uniforms scattered like trash. Reporters called it the darkest day in correctional history. But inside, it didn't feel like history. It felt like failure. The survivors, both guards and prisoners, were lined up outside in the cold. They were forced to kneel with their hands behind their heads, waiting for hours as police searched for weapons. Reaper was still alive, burned, bleeding, but alive. When the officers finally dragged him out, he smiled. "You can lock the cage again," he said, "but the fire's already in your walls." The warden watched him being carried away, jaw clenched. He knew what Reaper meant. This riot wasn't over. It was only the start of something bigger. The cover-up. A week later, the truth started to vanish. Officials held a press conference, calling the riot a sudden outbreak of inmate violence. They said it was about gangs, nothing more. But that was a lie. Inside documents told a different story. The riot had been building for months. The inmates had begged for medical care, complained about mold, rotten food, and cold showers. No one listened. When those letters leaked to the press, the warden panicked. He ordered his officers to destroy them. He said, "We can't let the world think this was our fault." Meanwhile, the surviving prisoners were moved to isolation. Tiny cells, 23 hours a day. No sunlight, no sound. One inmate, Luis, wrote on his wall with a piece of wire, "We screamed for help. They answered with bullets." When inspectors came, the guards cleaned everything. They painted over the bloodstains. They scrubbed the walls. By the time cameras returned, the prison looked calm, but was a graveyard. The world moved on. But those inside didn't forget. The testimony. Months later, a young journalist named Clara Hayes started digging into what really happened. She interviewed survivors, guards, nurses, even inmates released from solitary. They all told the same story. The riot wasn't just a random act of rage. It was a scream for dignity. One guard admitted, off camera, "We saw it coming. We told the warden. He didn't care." Another inmate said, "We were animals in cages, so we acted like animals." Clara's report shocked the nation. She uncovered secret footage from inside the prison, videos showing guards beating men during lockdowns, food trays full of mold and broken heaters in the middle of winter. When her story aired, people finally saw the truth, but the government denied everything. They said the footage was misleading. Clara received threats, anonymous calls. Her car was followed for days, but she didn't stop because she knew something deeper was still hidden, something about the warden himself. The warden's secret. The warden, Edward Banks, had run the prison for 15 years. He was known for being strict, no excuses, no compassion. But Clara discovered something that would ruin him. Before the riot, he had cut food and staff budgets and pocketed the leftover funds through a fake maintenance company. He had made money off the suffering of the men he was supposed to control. When one of his lieutenants found out, the warden silenced him, transferred him, then framed him for neglecting duty. That lieutenant later testified anonymously, saying, "The riot wasn't an accident. It was built from the inside." When the evidence leaked, the warden resigned for personal reasons. But he never faced trial. No charges, no punishment. He retired quietly to another state. And to this day, No one knows where he is. But the prisoners, they remembered his name. The ghost of the riot. Years passed. The prison was rebuilt, repainted, renamed, but the ghosts remained. New inmates whispered about what happened there. They said you could still hear screams echoing in the night. They said sometimes, during power cuts, the lights would flicker and the alarms would go off, as if the prison itself remembered. Reaper never saw the new prison. He died in another facility, solitary confinement, after 17 years behind steel doors. The last words he wrote on the wall before dying were, "They built this place to break us, but we broke it first." When Clara Hayes released her final documentary, she ended it with a haunting question. If a prison burns because its people have forgotten who's really responsible, the men inside or the world outside? The story shocked millions. It became a symbol of power, punishment, and what happens when humanity is ignored too long. And that's why, even today, people still whisper the same phrase when they talk about it. The most violent prison riot in history. Survivors of hell. Years after the riot, survivors still carried the scars, not just on their skin, but in their minds. Some of them couldn't sleep without hearing alarms in their dreams. Others couldn't eat off a metal tray again. One ex-inmate, Luis Mendoza, was released after serving his time. But freedom didn't feel real. He lived in a small apartment, the walls covered with newspaper clippings of the riot. He said, "You don't leave that place. It follows you." Luis had nightmares every night. Flames screaming, faces pressed against bars. Sometimes when the wind howled outside, he swore he heard the riot again, the sound of the gates slamming, the smell of smoke. He tried to get help, but no one cared. To the world, he was just another ex-convict. But what no one knew was that Luis kept a journal. Inside it, he wrote everything, names, dates, orders from guards, and even warnings that had been ignored before the riot. That journal will become the key to unlocking the truth, the forgotten files. In 2019, a maintenance worker cleaning an old prison storage room found a rusted metal box hidden behind the wall. Inside were old tapes, files, and letters marked confidential, do not release. Those documents revealed something horrifying. Weeks before the riot, prison officers had reported defective locks and malfunctioning doors, the same system that failed during the riot. The warnings were ignored because fixing them was too expensive. Even worse, one memo showed that the warden knew the riot risk was very high. He wrote, "Let them fight it out if they must. Maybe it'll scare them straight." That single sentence told everything. He didn't try to stop it. He let it happen. When the worker leaked those files to the journalist, the story exploded again. The government called it fake, but the public didn't buy it. Families of the dead, both inmates and guards, demanded justice. The old wounds reopened. The ghosts of the riot were back. The trial that never was. Protesters stood outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for Forgotten." But there would be no real trial. The warden, Edward Banks, had powerful friends. He disappeared before he could be questioned. His lawyers claimed he was too ill to attend and moved him to a private medical facility. He died 6 months later, quietly with no punishment. Inside the courtroom, Luis Mendoza sat in silence, clutching his old journal. The judge dismissed most of the claims. He said there wasn't enough proof. Luis stood up and said, "The proof is buried with the people you ignored." The room went silent. Everyone could feel the weight of his words. The trial ended, but the story didn't, because what came next changed how America looked at prisons forever. The documentary that shook America. A few years later, Clara Hayes, the journalist who had chased the story from the start, released her final work, a 3-hour documentary titled 47 Hours in Hell. It featured never-before-seen footage, interviews with survivors, guards, and the families of those who died. It was raw, it was real, and it made people cry. The film showed the prison's broken systems, the corruption, the ignored warnings. But it also showed something more powerful, the human cost. Clara ended the documentary with a haunting line. "A cage doesn't just hold men, it holds their pain. And when that pain breaks free, the whole world burns." The film won awards. Politicians promised reforms. But inside the system, little changed. New prisons were built, old mistakes repeated. And for the people who lived through it, justice was still a dream, the echo that never dies. Today, the old prison stands empty. Its walls are cracked, its cells filled with dust. But some say it still breathes. Guards who work the night shift in nearby facilities claim they hear faint screams carried by the wind, the echoes of the riot that refuse to fade. Tourists visit the site sometimes, snapping photos of the burned-out gym where hostages were once held. A guide tells them this is where the system collapsed on itself. In a small cemetery nearby, simple white markers show the graves of those who never made it out. No flowers, no names, just numbers. And among those graves lies a single stone that reads, "For the forgotten." It's said that every year on the anniversary of the riot, someone leaves a folded note on that grave. Written in shaky handwriting are 3 words. We remember everything. The riot may have ended decades ago, but its echo still haunts the walls. The men who survived, and a nation that still asks itself, how did it go so far? And could it happen again? The legacy of the riot didn't just destroy a prison, it destroyed trust. After that day, everything changed. Politicians swore it would never happen again. They promised new safety rules, better training, better food, better living conditions. But the truth? It all faded after a few months. Budgets were cut again. The guards got new uniforms, not new morals. And prisons kept filling up more men, less space. Inmate violence dropped for a while, but tension never disappeared. Some younger inmates whispered about finishing what Reaper started. They saw him not as a monster, but as a symbol, a man who stood against a system built to crush him. Years later, graffiti appeared on a prison wall hundreds of miles away. 47 hours in hell, we haven't forgotten. The message was clear. The riot had become legend, a warning carved into America's conscience. The secret experiments. What the public didn't know, what Clara Hayes discovered years later, was that the government had quietly used the riot as an excuse to run new control tests. Hidden in classified files, she found memos about a secret pilot program called Project Silent Cell. The plan was simple and terrifying: to study how long inmates could survive complete isolation without losing their minds. Inmates in the riot, especially those who fought hardest, were transferred to underground wings in undisclosed locations. No sunlight, no human contact, just 4 concrete walls and the hum of a fluorescent light that never turned off. The program was run under the banner of security research, but insiders later revealed the truth. It was psychological punishment disguised as science. One guard who later testified said, they weren't studying behavior, they were erasing it. When Clara published her findings, the documents mysteriously disappeared from the archives. Her apartment was broken into twice. But she didn't stop, because what she found next made everything worse. The prison of shadows. Through leaked transport records, Clara traced 38 missing inmates from the riot. Officially, they were transferred, but no one ever saw them again. Rumors spread among correctional officers about a facility deep in the desert, a place known only by its code name, Black Ridge. No public records, no visitors, no releases. It was said to be a place where inmates disappeared, a testing ground for extreme isolation technology, where silence was a weapon. An ex-officer described it as a prison built to erase ghosts, the men from the riot. When reporters tried to find Black Ridge, satellite images showed nothing but sand, but a faint outline of fences could be seen beneath the dunes. Something was there, and every time the subject came up, officials said the same thing. No comment. The confession. Before Clara could finish her investigation, she received a letter. It had no return address. Inside was a single page with 2 words at the top. From Reaper. But Reaper was dead. The letter read like a confession, or a warning. They told us we were monsters. But the real monsters wore badges. We weren't trying to escape. We were trying to be heard. Tell them that. The handwriting was shaky, but it matched Reaper's old records. Clara didn't know if it was real, but she believed it was. She ended her next report with this quote, saying, "If Reaper's voice still speaks from the grave, maybe it's because justice never did." The story broke the internet. Millions watched. The government stayed silent. But for the first time, the world started asking the right question. Not, how violent was the riot, but why did it have to happen at all? The final truth. Decades later, the prison where it all began is nothing but ruins. The metal rusted, the paint peeled, and weeds grew between the cracks. But under the floor of the old control room, demolition workers found something unexpected. A lock safe. Inside were audio tapes, old recordings made by the guards during the riot. And on one of those tapes was the warden's voice. You could hear him shouting over the radio, "Stand down. Let them burn themselves out. We'll move in when they're tired." That one line changed everything. The world finally knew. They could have stopped it. They chose not to. When the audio was released, it reignited national outrage. Documentaries, books, podcasts. Everyone wanted the truth. And Clara, older now, stood before a crowd and said, it wasn't just a riot. It was a message, a warning from inside the walls. She paused, looking straight into the camera. Because when you trap pain long enough, it explodes. And that explosion is what we call the most violent prison riot in history. The screen faded to black. A single caption appeared. In memory of all who never made it home. The fire that never died. The prison may be gone now, but the screams still live in the cracks of those old walls. They say at night, when the wind blows across the ruins, you can still hear the sound of steel gates slamming, and the echo of men who refuse to be forgotten. What happened inside those walls wasn't just violence. It was desperation. It was a system collapsing under its own cruelty. For 47 hours, the world saw what happens when pain is buried too long, when broken men are treated like ghosts until they decide to haunt back. The riot was called the most violent in history. But to the ones who survived, it wasn't just a riot. It was a voice no one wanted to hear, until it was too late. Reaper's final words, scratched into the wall before he died, still echo through time. They built this place to break us, but we broke it first. And maybe that's what the world needed to see. Because behind every headline, behind every wall, and behind every number in an orange jumpsuit, there's a story, a human story, waiting to be heard before it explodes again. The riot ended decades ago, but its ashes built a warning that still burns today. If justice sleeps too long, the walls will wake it up. Fade out, sirens in the distance, smoke drifting over cracked concrete, then silence,